Amidst the golden rice fields stretching endlessly beneath the Niigata sky, where the wind whispers in harmony with the quiet rhythm of a small village, nature does not merely give, it also tests, with sudden tempests of fury. Beneath the worn wooden roof, where the dim glow of an oil lamp flickered through lonely nights, Hiroshi, a hardened farmer, found a glimmer of light in the round eyes of Taro, the loyal dog whom fate had brought to him on a torrential rainy afternoon. But fate never allows peace to last forever. When dark clouds loomed, the wind howled through the towering pine trees, and floodwaters surged through the village as if to swallow everything in their path. The bond between Hiroshi and Taro was thrust into a life-or-death trial. Amidst the roaring waves and the blinding white of the downpour, Taro was no longer just a dog. He was a flickering flame in the storm, a bark echoing through the darkness, guiding the way to life on the thin line between survival and oblivion. This is the story of loyalty beyond limits, of silent promises etched beneath the ancient pines, and of how a small dog became a legend in the hearts of the people of Niigata. Step into this journey, where the wind will whisper to you of sacrifice, where the floodwaters will wash away loneliness, and where the friendship between man and animal will shine forever, like the moonlight piercing through the heart of the storm. Chapter 1: The Farmer and the Little Dog. In a small village nestled among the golden rice fields of Niigata, Japan, Hiroshi lived a quiet life in an old wooden house perched beside a dirt path leading to the fields. At 40 years old, his face bore the marks of hardship, his skin tanned from long days of labor under the sun, and his hands rough with calluses from plowing, harvesting, and repairing farming tools. His black hair, now streaked with silver, was often tied back with a small rope to keep it out of his way as he worked. His eyes always carried a trace of sorrow, as if memories of happier days had been buried beneath the dust of time. 5 years ago, his wife, Ayumi, passed away from a severe illness, leaving Hiroshi alone in the house that was once filled with laughter. Since then, he had lived in solitude, his only companions being the vast rice fields and the sound of the wind whispering through the roof on lonely nights. But Hiroshi was not entirely alone. 3 years ago, on a stormy afternoon, as he was cycling home from the village market on his old bicycle, he heard a faint whimper by the roadside. Stopping to look, he saw a small dog curled up beneath a bush, its wet fur a mix of white and brown, ears drooping, and round eyes staring at him with fear. It was just a tiny mixed-breed pup, likely abandoned by someone. Hiroshi had no intention of keeping it. He didn't want to add another burden to his already difficult life. But when the trembling puppy struggled to stand and limped after him along the muddy path, Hiroshi's heart softened. He picked it up, dried it off with an old cloth, and gave it a small portion of his leftover dinner. From that night on, the little dog stayed, and Hiroshi named him Taro, a simple, familiar name, much like the way the Japanese often name their loyal dogs. Taro quickly became Hiroshi's only companion. Every morning, as the sun rose over the distant hills, Taro followed him to the fields, its small paws padding quickly along the red earth path. It would often lie under the shade of an old pine tree near the fields, waiting as Hiroshi plowed, sowed seeds, or pulled weeds. At noon, when Hiroshi took a break beneath the tree, unwrapping his rice balls wrapped in bamboo leaves, with a bit of dried fish and sour umeboshi inside, Taro would lie beside him, wagging its tail excitedly whenever Hiroshi shared a small bite. The villagers, long accustomed to this sight, began calling Taro Hiroshi's shadow. Old Kenji, the seed vendor at the market, once laughed and said, "That Taro is more loyal than my own sons." Hiroshi simply smiled, stroked Taro's head, and replied, "He's my family." To him, Taro was more than just a dog, it was a small light in the endless days of solitude. Chapter 2: Signs Before the Storm. That autumn, the atmosphere in Niigata grew heavy and strange. Unusually strong winds swept through the village, carrying the chill of the Sea of Japan, and making the Norin curtains flutter restlessly in front of the houses. Thick black clouds rolled in from the west, obscuring the gentle October sunlight. Villagers whispered anxiously during gatherings at the home of the village elder, Sato, a man with snow-white hair and a deep, steady voice. They spoke of nature's warnings, birds flying erratically across the sky, fish in the ponds swimming restlessly, and the wind howling like the cries of ancient spirits. Sato, having witnessed many storms in his lifetime, furrowed his brows as he gazed at the sky. "This storm is not normal," he muttered. "It may be bigger than anything we've seen before." Hiroshi, accustomed to the steady rhythm of a farmer's life, paid little mind to the warnings. He continued going to the fields each day, plowing the land in preparation for the winter rice crop, believing that nature would not be too harsh on those who lived by its grace. But Taro was different. The dog had been acting strangely for days before the storm's arrival. It barked incessantly at night, standing at the doorway, staring out into the dark fields, its ears twitching with unease. Even when exhausted from a long day of work, Hiroshi would sit up on his tatami mat, pulling Taro close. "What's wrong with you?" "It's just a little wind," he murmured. But Taro remained restless. It refused to eat, lying by the door with its bright eyes fixed on the night, as if waiting for something. One afternoon, while Hiroshi was tying up stalks of rice that had been bent by the wind, he noticed that Taro was not resting under the old pine tree as usual. Instead, the dog stood atop a small mound, nose lifted to the air, sniffing the wind, before turning back and barking furiously in his direction. Hiroshi frowned and walked over, running a hand over Taro's head. "What's the matter? Don't make me worry." But when he looked up, he saw the black clouds churning faster, moving like a massive wall closing in on the village. A heavy feeling settled in his chest, an unease he couldn't quite explain. That night, lying on his tatami mat, Hiroshi listened to the wind howling through the wooden cracks of his home, the eerie whistling mingling with Taro's low growls. Sleep eluded him. As he stared at the ceiling, he found himself whispering, "Maybe Taro is right. Something isn't right at all." Chapter 3: The Storm Strikes. The next morning, the storm crashed down upon Niigata with terrifying force, as if nature sought to punish everything in its path. The wind howled, tearing through thatched roofs, sending wooden planks and stacks of dried straw flying from village porches. Rain poured down in torrents, each heavy drop pounding the earth, turning the dirt roads into thick, swirling mud. Hiroshi woke early, startled by the relentless drumming of rain against the roof. He hurried to his feet, threw on his worn-out raincoat, and began fastening the doors with wooden planks he had stored in the shed. Taro dashed around the house, barking nonstop, his small paws gripping the wooden floor as if trying to warn Hiroshi of something far worse. The sky was an ominous shade of gray, though it was only 8 in the morning. Peering through a crack in the door, Hiroshi saw the fields outside flattened by the wind, while rainwater flooded the rice paddies he had tended for months. He let out a weary sigh, thinking that as long as they stayed indoors, he and Taro would be safe. But then, a thunderous explosion shook the village. The small levee near the village, the only barrier holding back the waters of the Shinano River, had burst under the relentless pressure of the storm. A raging flood surged forward, carrying debris, broken branches, and anything unfortunate enough to be caught in its path. Hiroshi could hear the deafening roar of water approaching, his heart pounding in his chest. Throwing open the door, he rushed toward the chicken coop behind his house, desperate to save the few remaining livestock that sustained him. But the moment he stepped outside, a sudden, powerful wave slammed into him, knocking him off his feet and sweeping him into the swirling current. Hiroshi thrashed against the water, reaching for a drifting log, but the current was too strong, dragging him farther and farther from his home. He gasped for air, his limbs growing numb from the cold, and for a fleeting moment he thought this was the end. Then, he felt something tugging at his sleeve. Looking down, he saw Taro, his small legs paddling furiously against the raging current, teeth clamped tightly onto Hiroshi's sleeve. The little dog pulled with all its might, guiding Hiroshi toward a large pine tree standing on a raised mound, one of the last spots untouched by the floodwaters. Hiroshi clung to Taro, letting the dog lead the way. Finally, he managed to grab onto the tree trunk, gasping for breath as he pulled himself onto the higher ground. Soaked and shivering, he cradled Taro in his arms, whispering against the roaring wind, "You're crazy, Taro." "But thank you." Chapter 4: The battle against the flood. The floodwaters rose rapidly, turning the entire village into a chaotic sea. Giant waves crashed against the pine tree, carrying soil, broken branches, and debris from villagers' homes. Hiroshi clung tightly to the tree trunk, holding Taro in his arms, both of them drenched and shivering in the biting cold. The wind howled, snapping smaller branches that fell into the water with small splashes, lost in the roaring storm. Hiroshi looked around, seeing his house reduced to a faint silhouette in the white curtain of rain. His heart sank, knowing that months of hard work had been washed away in an instant. Taro never left Hiroshi's side, not even for a moment. The small dog stood close to him, its bright eyes locked onto the raging waters as if keeping watch for danger. Suddenly, a massive log came hurtling toward them with terrifying speed. Hiroshi had no time to react, but Taro barked loudly and leapt into the water just before the log could hit them. With all its tiny strength, Taro pushed the log off course, then struggled back through the currents to Hiroshi's side, its wet fur clinging to its thin body. Hiroshi shouted over the storm, "Taro, don't do that! You'll get yourself killed!" But the little dog simply pressed its head against his hand, eyes glowing with determination as if to say, "I won't leave you." Hiroshi held Taro tightly, tears mixing with the rain, his heart aching at the thought of the dog risking its life for him. The storm showed no mercy. The water kept rising, reaching the middle of the pine tree's trunk. Hiroshi felt his limbs growing numb, his strength fading fast. He whispered to Taro, "If I don't make it, you have to survive, understand?" But Taro growled softly in defiance, and gently bit his hand, as if to keep him awake. They clung to each other in the middle of the storm, waiting for a miracle in the endless darkness of the night. Chapter 5: A Light in the Night. The storm raged on until midnight, showing no signs of weakening. Hiroshi was exhausted, his body freezing from being submerged in the water for too long, his mind growing hazy. He thought of Ayumi, of the days they worked in the fields together, laughing under the soft autumn sun. Maybe, he thought, he would see her again beneath these waters. Taro was weak too, its breath short and rapid, its soaked fur pressed tightly against his chest. Yet the little dog never stopped growling, barking into the darkness as if calling for someone. Hiroshi stroked its head and murmured, "Don't try so hard, Taro. Just rest." Suddenly, a beam of light pierced through the thick rain from afar. Hiroshi looked up, thinking he was hallucinating. But the light grew larger, accompanied by the faint sound of oars gently breaking the water's surface. It was the village's rescue team, led by the elder Sato. They rowed a small wooden boat, carrying lanterns and ropes, moving steadily toward the pine tree. Later, Sato would recall that they had searched the entire village, but in the roaring wind and the chaotic darkness, they couldn't find Hiroshi, until they heard Taro's relentless barking. "That barking was like a lighthouse in the storm," he said. The rescue team threw a rope toward Hiroshi. With the last of his strength, he tied it around himself and Taro, allowing them to be pulled onto the boat. One of the rescuers, a young man named Takeshi, wrapped a warm blanket around Hiroshi and Taro, saying, "If it weren't for Taro, you'd be done for." Hiroshi held the little dog tightly, tears falling onto its wet fur. "You saved me, Taro," he whispered. "I owe you my life." The boat made its way toward Sato's house, the highest point in the village, still untouched by the flood, carrying Hiroshi and Taro, two survivors of the terrifying storm. Chapter 6: After the Storm. The storm passed the next morning, leaving the village in ruins as if it had just endured a fierce battle. Roofs were torn off, trees lay uprooted, and the rice fields, Niigata's pride, were now nothing but a vast, muddy sea. Hiroshi sat inside Sato's house, where the villagers had gathered to share food and blankets, staring at the devastated landscape through a broken window. His wooden house was almost completely submerged, with only the roof peeking above the water's surface. His chickens, his stored sacks of rice, everything had been washed away by the flood. But he was alive, thanks to Taro. Taro lay beside Hiroshi, its eyes weary but its tail still wagging weakly whenever he stroked its head. The little dog was soaked and shivering, yet it never left his side. Despite their own exhaustion and worries, the villagers brought bits of rice and dried fish for Taro. Hana, an elderly woman who lived next door to Hiroshi, placed a steaming bowl of miso soup in front of him and said, "Eat, Hiroshi. And feed Taro too. He's our hero today." Even Sato, who had never liked dogs because their barking disrupted his sleep, looked at Taro and nodded. "This little guy didn't just save you. He saved my faith in these animals." Hiroshi said nothing. He simply held Taro tighter, feeling the warmth of its small body. A mix of gratitude and fear filled his heart. He had come so close to losing the only friend he had left. He thought of Ayumi, of the days she had told him, "You need someone by your side, Hiroshi, so you won't be alone." Now, he realized that Taro was the someone she had meant. That night, as the villagers fell asleep on Sato's floor, Hiroshi sat beside Taro and whispered, "I won't let you suffer because of me ever again." Chapter 7: A Promise in the Rice Fields. In the days after the storm, the villagers began cleaning up and rebuilding their lives. Hiroshi worked alongside them to repair the broken levee, salvage wooden planks from the flood, and tried to save what little rice remained in the fields. His house had been severely damaged, but with the help of Sato and Takeshi, he managed to rebuild a small corner to stay in temporarily. Taro slowly recovered, running around Hiroshi like before, though he still limped slightly from the exhaustion of the storm. Villagers would often stop to pet Taro when passing by, offering him bits of dried fish or a piece of mochi as a token of gratitude. One afternoon, as the setting sun cast a crimson glow over the flooded rice fields, Hiroshi sat on a small hill, gazing at the ruins of what he once called home. Taro lay beside him, resting its small head on his leg, eyes half closed in the golden light. Hiroshi sighed, stroking the little dog's head. "You risked your life for me, Taro. I don't know how I can ever repay you." He recalled the moment Taro jumped into the water to push the log away, the sound of its barking piercing through the stormy night. His chest tightened at the thought of almost losing Taro. He whispered, "From now on I'll protect you. I promise." Standing up, he searched through the debris and found a piece of wood from his old house. Taking the small knife from his pocket, he carefully carved the name Taro onto it with trembling strokes. Then, he tied the piece of wood in front of his temporary home with a rope. It wasn't just the name of his dog, it was a reminder of its sacrifice, a promise he would keep for the rest of his life. Taro lifted its head, looking up at him before pressing its face against his leg, as if it understood. Hiroshi smiled, a rare, genuine smile, the first since Ayumi had passed away. Chapter 8: The Peaceful Years. Time passed, and Hiroshi and Taro lived peacefully after the storm. With the villagers' help, he rebuilt his home, though it was no longer as sturdy as before. He replanted rice on the dry patches of land, though the harvests were never as plentiful. Taro remained his ever-present shadow, following him to the fields each day, resting under the old pine tree, and sharing rice balls with him under the golden sunset. The villagers now saw Taro as a symbol of loyalty. Old Kenji would often bring dried fish, saying, "Feed the boy, he deserves it." Grandma Hana even wove a small straw collar for Taro, joking, "Like a medal for a hero." Hiroshi gradually opened his heart to the people around him. He no longer avoided gatherings at Sato's house, where the villagers drank tea and shared stories. He told them about Taro, how the little dog had saved him, and sometimes chuckled when the village children called Taro a super dog. But time did not stand still. One winter day, as snow blanketed Niigata in pure white, Hiroshi realized that Taro had grown old. His steps became slower, his fur peppered with silver, and he no longer ran like before. Hiroshi prepared a warm spot near the hearth, laying down a mat for Taro to rest, and spent many nights sitting beside him. One evening, as the snow fell thick outside the door, Hiroshi held Taro in his arms, stroking its soft fur. He whispered, "You've done enough, Taro. Rest now." The dog opened its eyes, wagged its tail weakly one last time, then closed its eyes forever, passing away peacefully in Hiroshi's embrace. He did not cry but sat beside Taro all night, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks of the house. The next morning, he buried Taro under the pine tree, the very place where they had clung to life during the storm, and placed a small stone engraved with the words, "My friend," on its grave. Standing in the falling snow, he whispered, "Thank you, Taro." Chapter 9: Taro's Legacy. Hiroshi lived many years after Taro's passing but never kept another dog. To him, Taro was irreplaceable, the only companion he had truly needed. He continued working in the fields, living a simple life in his wooden home, and often visited Taro's grave under the pine tree. He shared stories of Taro with the village children who grew up hearing the legend of the dog who saved its master in the storm. Kenta, Kenji's son, would sit beside him, eyes shining with excitement. "I want a dog like Taro!" he would exclaim. Hiroshi smiled. "You will if you treat it well." The tale of Taro spread beyond the rice fields of Niigata, becoming a local legend. The villagers erected a small wooden statue of Taro beside the pine tree, carved by Takeshi, now a skilled woodworker. The statue was simple, depicting Taro standing with its head held high, ears slightly drooped, and tail wagging, yet it captured the spirit of the heroic dog. Whenever a storm approached, people would say the wind carried Taro's bark, guiding those who were lost. Even as Hiroshi grew old, he believed that Taro had never truly left his side. When Hiroshi passed away at the age of 70, the villagers held a simple funeral beneath the pine tree. With no children of his own, he left his house and rice fields to Kenta, now a young man, with one condition, that he take care of the pine tree and Taro's statue. Kenta nodded, promising to preserve the legacy. That night, as the moon shone brightly over Niigata, Kenta stood beside the pine tree, listening to the wind rustle through its branches. He smiled and whispered, "Taro, Grandpa Hiroshi, I won't forget either of you." Chapter 10: The Successor Beneath the Pine Tree. After Hiroshi passed away, Kenta, a bright-eyed young man of 20 with a carefree smile, became the inheritor of the wooden house and rice fields. Kenta was the youngest son of Kenji, the village seed vendor, and had grown up mesmerized by the tale of Hiroshi and Taro. As a child, he would spend countless afternoons on Sato's porch, listening to Hiroshi recount the story of the dog who had saved its master during the storm, secretly dreaming of one day having a companion like Taro. When Hiroshi entrusted him with his legacy, asking only that he care for the pine tree and the wooden statue, Kenta accepted without hesitation. To him, it was not just a duty, it was an honor to continue a legend. Kenta moved into the wooden house in early spring, when cherry blossoms lined the village paths in full bloom. The house bore the marks of time, weathered wooden panels, moss-covered roof tiles, and a quiet corner by the hearth where Taro had once slept. He cleaned every nook and cranny, leaving untouched the wooden plaque bearing Taro's name that Hiroshi had hung at the entrance. He brought a fresh tatami mat to lay in the main room. Each morning, after tending to the fields and sowing the seeds given by his father, he would visit the pine tree, sweeping around Taro's statue, wiping dust from the carved wood, and whispering, "Taro, Grandpa Hiroshi, I won't let you down." One afternoon, as Kenta was pulling weeds in the rice fields, a faint whimper came from a nearby thicket. Curious, he followed the sound and discovered a tiny, trembling black puppy, its fur matted and eyes wide with hunger. The way it looked at him reminded him of the story Hiroshi had once told, of the day he first met Taro. Without hesitation, Kenta scooped up the little pup, brought it home, warmed it with a bowl of rice water, and named it Kuro, meaning black, in Japanese, after its dark fur. Kuro quickly became Kenta's loyal companion, following him to the fields, resting beneath the pine tree, and wagging its tail eagerly whenever Kenta shared his rice balls. The villagers, seeing Kuro, laughed and said, "Looks like another Taro has appeared." Kenta simply smiled, his heart believing that this was a gift, one sent from somewhere far beyond, from Hiroshi and Taro themselves. Chapter 11: The Bark in the Wind. That summer, Niigata once again faced unusual signs from nature. Sudden hot winds blew through the village, carrying heavy moisture from the Sea of Japan. The villagers murmured anxiously, recalling the terrifying storm from years ago that had nearly taken Hiroshi's life. Old man Sato, now even older, his hair as white as snow, sat on his porch gazing at the sky, muttering, "Another storm? This time, we must prepare better." He called Kenta over and instructed him to reinforce the house and inspect the levee that had been rebuilt after the last great storm. Kenta obeyed, spending the entire day tying down the roof with ropes, adding wooden planks to the windows, and checking the levee with his father, Kenji. Though still small, Kuro ran around Kenta, barking loudly every time the wind grew stronger. Kenta patted its head and chuckled. "You're just like Taro, worrying even when you don't understand what's happening." But that night, as Kenta lay on his tatami mat, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, he felt an unease similar to what Hiroshi had once described. Kuro stayed awake, standing at the door, growling softly, its small ears perked up in alertness. The next morning, the storm hit, not as strong as the one from years past, but powerful enough to shake the village. Rain poured down, and fierce winds bent the trees. Kenta remained inside, holding Kuro, hoping the storm would pass quickly. But then, he heard a distant scream, a child's cry. Riku, the young son of Mrs. Hana, had been trapped near the levee while trying to run home. Without hesitation, Kenta grabbed his raincoat, took Kuro by the paw, and dashed outside. The floodwaters from the levee had begun to overflow, not deep, but dangerous enough for a small child. Kenta spotted Riku clinging to a rock, sobbing in the rain. Kuro barked loudly and ran ahead, leading the way through the muddy water. Kenta followed, crawling through the mud until he finally reached Riku and pulled him up onto higher ground. Holding the boy tightly, he shouted over the roaring wind, "Take my hand!" Kuro grabbed Riku's sleeve with its teeth, helping Kenta pull the child to safety. When the three of them finally returned to Old Man Sato's house, Mrs. Hana collapsed in relief, hugging Riku tightly before turning to Kenta and Kuro. "Thank you, both of you. You are our saviors." Kenta stroked Kuro's wet fur and whispered, "You did well, just like Taro." Chapter 12: The Fire in the Rain. Years passed, and Kenta grew into a strong man, continuing to care for Hiroshi's rice fields and wooden house. Kuro also matured, its sleek black fur and agile frame making it an irreplaceable companion. The villagers adored Kuro as they once had Taro, often bringing food and retelling the story of how it had saved Riku. But a new challenge arrived one winter night when heavy snow blanketed Niigata, and the wind cut like a blade. A sudden lightning strike hit the old granary near Kenta's home, igniting a fire amid the snowfall. The flames spread quickly, threatening to consume the wooden house, Hiroshi's last remaining legacy. Kenta was jolted awake by Kuro's frantic barking. He rushed outside and saw thick black smoke rising into the sky. Shouting for the villagers, he fought against the bitter wind, but the storm only fueled the raging fire. Kuro darted around, barking loudly to wake everyone, then dashed into the smoke. Moments later, it emerged, gripping a soaked blanket from a water barrel in its teeth and dragging it toward Kenta. Kenta used the wet blanket to beat down the flames as the villagers arrived, carrying buckets of water and damp cloths. Together, they battled the fire for hours, finally extinguishing it before the house was completely lost. Exhausted, Kenta collapsed onto the ground, panting. He pulled Kuro into his arms. "You saved me again, Kuro!" The villagers gazed at Kuro in awe, whispering, "It's Taro reborn!" Kenta smiled, running his fingers through Kuro's damp fur, filled with gratitude and pride. Chapter 13: A Farewell in the Snow. Time passed, and Kenta grew old, his hair streaked with silver like Hiroshi's had been. Kuro, too, slowed down, its legs no longer as swift, its eyes beginning to dim. One winter day, as snow blanketed Niigata in white, Kenta sat by the fireplace, cradling Kuro in his arms. He whispered softly, "You've done so much for me, Kuro. It's time to rest." Kuro nuzzled against his hand, its tail giving one final, gentle wag before closing its eyes, passing away peacefully, just as Taro had. Kenta buried Kuro beside Taro's grave beneath the great pine tree, placing a small stone marker inscribed with Kuro, the second friend. Standing there, watching the snow settle over the two graves, he smiled. Taro, Kuro, you two were my family, and Hiroshi's. The villagers came to pay their respects, leaving dried flowers on the graves. Together, they lit a small oil lamp, its flame flickering softly in remembrance. Chapter 14. A Legend That Lives On. Kenta lived to the age of 70, passing down the stories of Taro and Kuro to the younger generations. When he passed away, the villagers carved another wooden statue, this time of Kuro, placing it beside Taro beneath the pine tree. The tale of Hiroshi, Taro, Kenta, and Kuro became a legend in Niigata, passed down through the ages. Whenever storms or hardships arose, the villagers swore they could still hear barking in the wind, believing that Taro and Kuro remained, guiding those in need. The small village, once known only for its rice fields, became famous for something even greater, the timeless bond between humans and their loyal dogs. Beneath the great pine tree, the two wooden statues stood side by side, silent and steadfast, symbols of loyalty and love that would never fade.